The streets of New York shimmered with the reflection of neon lights as the night settled in, but for Richard Carter, none of the city's brilliance mattered. Inside his luxury black SUV, parked just off Fifth Avenue, he sat gripping the leather steering wheel, his mind heavy. He was a man who owned skyscrapers, airlines, and half a dozen companies. Yet at that moment, he felt powerless. His wife Anna, once vibrant and full of life, had been bound to a wheelchair for 3 long years after a brutal car accident. The finest doctors, the most expensive treatments, and endless therapy sessions, nothing had restored her ability to walk. Richard felt like a failure, not because of his businesses, but because he couldn't give Anna back the one thing she missed most, her freedom. The quiet hum of the city outside mocked his silence inside the car. Richard leaned his head back, closing his eyes as memories of Anna before the accident replayed. Her laughter echoed in his mind, the way she would run barefoot across their beach house porch, or how she'd spin in a dress just to see him smile. Those moments seemed like another lifetime now. Guilt gnawed at him. He had all the wealth in the world, but what good was it if he couldn't save the woman he loved? Pushing open the SUV door, he stepped into the crisp night air, his breath visible under the glow of the street. The air smelled faintly of roasted peanuts from a nearby vendor and wet asphalt from a drizzle earlier that evening. Richard shoved his hands into his coat pockets, trying to clear his head. Little did he know, fate was about to present him with something money could never buy. As Richard walked down the dimly lit sidewalk, he noticed a small figure sitting on the cold pavement, half hidden near a building's entrance. At first glance, he thought it was just another homeless person among the countless faces New York turned away from daily. But when the figure shifted, Richard realized it was a child. A boy, no more than 10, with messy blonde hair that stuck out in every direction. His clothes were ragged, an oversized sweater with holes in the sleeves, torn jeans, and shoes that looked ready to fall apart. What caught Richard's attention, however, were the boy's eyes. Unlike his worn appearance, his eyes held an unusual steadiness, almost as if he carried a secret far beyond his years. Richard slowed his pace, unsure why he couldn't just walk past like others did. The boy lifted his gaze, and for a moment, they locked eyes. Something about that stare unsettled Richard, not fear, not pity, but recognition, as if the boy had been waiting for him. Richard's instinct was to turn away, but before he could, the boy stood and walked toward him. His small frame looked fragile against the towering businessman. Richard straightened, preparing himself for the usual plea for food or money. Instead, the boy's voice came soft but clear, cutting through the hum of traffic around them. "Sir," he said, his tone almost gentle, "I can make your wife walk again." For a second, Richard froze in place, his mind refusing to process the words. He felt as if the ground beneath him had tilted. The boy couldn't possibly know. Richard hadn't spoken to him before, hadn't given away anything about Anna. His chest tightened. "What did you just say?" Richard demanded, his voice sharper than intended. The boy didn't flinch. He simply repeated, "I can make your wife walk again." His small hands trembled slightly in the cold, but his eyes never wavered. It was audacious, impossible, and yet Richard felt the faintest chill of hope creep into his heart. Anger rose to cover his confusion. "Kid, don't play games with me," Richard said sternly, his voice echoing across the empty stretch of street. "You don't know what you're talking about." He expected the boy to shrink back, maybe run away, like most kids would when confronted by a powerful man. But instead, the boy stood taller, his chin lifting with quiet conviction. "I know," he insisted. "I've helped before. My father taught me things doctors don't believe in. They said the same to him, but he healed people they gave up on." His words carried no arrogance, only calm certainty. Richard's heart pounded. He wanted to dismiss it as nonsense. Yet the boy's tone left a crack in his armor of disbelief. The city sounds seemed to fade around them as Richard studied the child, searching for a sign of deceit. There was none. The boy's clothes screamed poverty. His face was thin with hunger, but his eyes carried a truth Richard couldn't ignore. A part of him, buried deep under years of disappointment, wanted desperately to believe. Anna's smile flashed before him again, the way she used to dance in their kitchen while cooking. That memory collided with the boy's words, pulling at his guarded heart. Richard clenched his fists. Was he really considering the impossible? Could this boy, a homeless child on the streets of New York, succeed where the best doctors had failed? Richard exhaled slowly, struggling to regain control of his thoughts. He crouched slightly to meet the boy at eye level, his tailored coat brushing the pavement. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his tone less harsh now. The boy hesitated, then replied, "Ethan." The name lingered in the cool air between them. Richard searched his eyes again, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him that the doctors and specialists had long crushed hope. Ethan's small frame seemed almost fragile against the skyscrapers towering behind him, but his presence carried a weight Richard couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long while, Richard Carter, the man who thought he had seen it all, found himself speechless, frozen by the audacity of a child's promise. Richard's voice echoed harshly against the stone walls of the empty street. "Kid, don't play with me," he snapped, his patience thinning like glass on the edge of breaking. He had heard every lie imaginable, people offering miracle cures, schemes designed to prey on his wealth and desperation. But when Richard's glare met the boy's steady eyes, his anger faltered. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't cower, like a child should, under the shadow of a powerful man. Instead, his gaze held firm, calm, almost too mature for his fragile frame. Richard, for all his sharp instincts in the business world, felt something strange in that look, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't manipulation, it was conviction, pure and unshaken. And that conviction disarmed him in a way no boardroom rival ever had. The boy shifted his torn sweater tighter around his shoulders as the night breeze swept down the avenue. "My name's Ethan," he said quietly, almost like a confession. "My father, he was a healer, not the kind you find in hospitals. He helped people when doctors told them there was no hope." Richard studied him closely, his jaw tight. Ethan's voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "When he died, he left me what he knew. The methods are unusual, but they work. Pressure points, nerve stimulation, breathing things that wake up what everyone else says is gone." Richard frowned, his skepticism rising again. He had sat in world-class medical centers and heard neurologists say Anna's condition was irreversible. And yet, here was a homeless boy in rags, claiming to hold a forgotten secret. Richard wanted to scoff, to end the conversation and walk back to the safety of disbelief. But a spark, tiny and fragile, glowed inside him. It was the same spark he had felt when Anna had first smiled at him years ago. The same spark he thought had died when the doctors gave up. His mind wrestled with logic. Could this boy really have something the brightest medical teams didn't? "You expect me to believe a child has answers an entire hospital doesn't?" Richard asked coldly. Ethan didn't back down. "I don't expect you to believe, sir," he said with surprising calmness. "I expect you to try, because you love her, and because you have nothing left to lose." His words cut deeper than Richard wanted to admit. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic. Richard's fists clenched in his pockets. He hated being cornered. Hated when someone forced him to face truths he buried. Yet this boy, without even trying, had done just that. "If you're lying," Richard finally said, his voice low, dangerous, "you'll regret it." His eyes hardened, but beneath them, a crack of vulnerability showed. "But if you're telling the truth, if there's even a chance," his voice broke slightly before he caught himself. He straightened his shoulders and finished, "You'll save my family." Ethan nodded, his expression neither smug nor triumphant, just steady, like he had been waiting for this moment all along. Richard turned toward his SUV, motioning for Ethan to follow. The boy hesitated for a second, then walked beside him, his small steps quick to keep pace. As the doors unlocked with a soft click, Richard glanced at Ethan again. The absurdity of it all struck him. He, one of the richest men in America, was about to bring a homeless child into his home on nothing but faith and desperation. But Anna's face rose in his mind, her tired smile, her unspoken longing. That was enough. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat, his wide eyes darting nervously at the sleek interior. He touched nothing, just sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. Richard slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the quiet purr-filling the silence between them. For the first time in years, Richard felt his heart racing with something other than despair. The drive to Richard's mansion on the outskirts of the city was quiet, broken only by the hum of tires against asphalt. Richard's mind spun with doubts. Was he being reckless? Was he inviting a scam into his life? Yet every time he glanced at Ethan, sitting small and still beside him, he couldn't shake the boy's earlier words. "Because you have nothing left to lose." They rang in his head like a haunting truth. Finally, unable to contain his unease, Richard asked, "Where did your father learn all this? What makes you so sure it works?" Ethan looked out the window, his reflection ghosting against the glass. He said, "Healing isn't just about medicine. It's about listening to the body, reminding it how to be alive again. I've seen him do it, sir. People walked when they were told they never would. He made me promise I'd keep helping, even if no one believed." His voice wavered slightly, revealing the child beneath the wisdom. Richard tightened his grip on the wheel, his mind torn in two directions. Logic screamed that this was foolish, a desperate grab at false hope. But another part of him, the part that had loved Anna since they were teenagers, whispered that maybe, just maybe, miracles wore disguises. As the SUV turned down the long, tree-lined driveway toward the Carter estate, Richard's chest tightened. He was about to bring Ethan into a world far removed from the boy's cold streets. He didn't know if this was the beginning of healing or another heartbreak, but he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore the possibility. Glancing at Ethan once more, Richard felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Not certainty, not belief, but hope, the most dangerous, and yet the most necessary, thing of all. The Carter mansion, grand and sprawling, usually held an air of cold sophistication, but that night it was strangely tense and quiet. Nurses moved about uneasily, their skepticism thinly veiled as they stole curious glances at the frail boy in the room. Ethan sat on a stool pulled beside Anna's wheelchair, his small hands folded in concentration before he began. Anna, elegant, even in her fragility, watched him with kind curiosity, her pale fingers resting on her lap. Richard stood by the window, arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched as if bracing for disappointment. The boy took a deep breath, then leaned forward, pressing his tiny fingers against precise points along Anna's legs. His touch was firm but careful, as if guided by knowledge far beyond his years. "Breathe with me," Ethan whispered, his voice soft, yet commanding. "Feel the ground beneath you. Your body remembers, even if your mind has forgotten." The room filled with a strange rhythm, the soft sound of Anna's controlled breathing, and the quiet murmurs of Ethan's instructions. Minutes dragged into long stretches, each second heavy with doubt. Sweat trickled down Ethan's forehead, darkening his blonde hair as he worked with unwavering focus. The nurses exchanged impatient glances, their skepticism growing. One leaned toward Richard and muttered, "Sir, this isn't medical treatment. This is nonsense." But Richard raised a sharp hand to silence him. Something in the boy's determination kept him rooted in place, unable to dismiss it so easily. He remembered Ethan's words, "Because you have nothing left to lose." That truth weighed heavily on him as he watched his wife, her lips parted, following Ethan's breathing pattern with surprising commitment. She wanted this to work. She wanted to believe, even if only for one night. Nearly an hour passed. The tension in the air grew suffocating. Ethan's small hands trembled, but he refused to stop. His fingers moved carefully, pressing into nerves, along Anna's thighs and calves, coaxing something hidden deep within them. His young face, red with effort, looked far older in its concentration. Richard's stomach churned. He wanted to call it off, to protect his wife from yet another cruel disappointment. But then, it happened. Anna suddenly gasped, her eyes widening as if struck by lightning. A faint shudder ran down her leg, and her right foot twitched a sharp, undeniable movement. The nurses froze mid-breath, their eyes widening. Richard felt his heart hammer against his chest. It had been 3 long years since he'd seen even the faintest sign of life in those legs. Anna's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "Richard," her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. I felt that, for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Richard's vision blurred, his throat tight as he turned to her. You're sure?" he asked, his voice trembling in a way his board of directors would never believe. Anna nodded, her face streaked with tears. "Yes, I felt it, like a spark inside me." One of the nurses gasped, unable to contain her shock, and quickly crouched to examine Anna's leg. She touched her foot gently, testing, as if she couldn't believe her own eyes. "There's movement," she murmured, almost in disbelief. "I swear, I saw it twitch." The other nurse, who moments ago had been skeptical, now stared at Ethan with an expression bordering on awe. Richard's jaw tightened, and emotion surged inside him like a storm. For years, he had listened to doctors and specialists, spending millions, only to hear the same sentence. "There's nothing more we can do." He had buried hope so deep he thought it would never resurface. But now, because of a homeless boy with trembling hands, hope had returned to live fragile but real. Ethan swayed slightly, exhaustion showing in his posture, but he didn't stop. His voice shook as he urged Anna to keep breathing, to focus on the sensations. "Your body is listening," he whispered. "It remembers how to move. Don't give up on it, not now." Anna clutched the sides of her chair, her chest heaving with each controlled breath. She closed her eyes, concentrating with every fiber of her being. The room had transformed into something sacred, like a cathedral of silence and anticipation. Richard's eyes never left his wife. His heart split between fear and elation. He knew what he had just witnessed wasn't an illusion. This was real, even if it was only a flicker. One of the nurses whispered, "This shouldn't be possible." But Richard, with tears gathering in his eyes, finally allowed himself to whisper back, "Maybe it shouldn't, but it is." Ethan leaned back at last, his hands slipping away from Anna's legs. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his young body trembling with fatigue. Yet, despite his exhaustion, a faint smile tugged at his lips. "She felt it," he said softly, almost to himself, as though fulfilling a promise made long ago. Anna reached out, her hand trembling as she touched Richard's. For the first time in years, her eyes didn't carry resignation, they carried hope. "Richard," she said through her tears, "what if this is the beginning?" Richard gripped her hand tightly, his own tears finally spilling free. "Then we hold on to it," he whispered fiercely, as though daring the universe to take it away. Ethan sat quietly, his small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the room. Yet in that moment, he was the most powerful presence there. The Carter mansion, once filled with cold marble and polished silence, now vibrated with something it hadn't held in years' life, possibility and faith. For a long while, no one spoke. Everyone in the room seemed caught between disbelief and afraid that breaking the silence would shatter the miracle they had just witnessed. Anna looked down at her leg again, as if trying to convince herself it hadn't been her imagination. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something inside her had awakened. Something no doctor had been able to reach. And it had taken a boy with nothing but knowledge, courage, and a heart full of determination to remind her body how to listen again. That night, as Richard helped his exhausted wife into bed, he stole one last glance at Ethan. The boy had slumped against the wall, his eyes heavy with fatigue, but there was a quiet pride in his expression. Richard knew then that this was only the beginning and that his family's life had just changed forever. The following days in the Carter mansion were unlike any the family had ever experienced. What had once been a home of quiet despair was now alive with cautious hope. Each morning, Ethan would rise early, still wearing the same faded clothes he had arrived in, and sit by Anna's side. His hands, though small and often trembling, carried purpose and confidence beyond his years. He repeated the same regimen, pressing pressure points, guiding her breath, and whispering words of encouragement that lit sparks of determination in Anna's heart. The nurses, once skeptical, now followed his lead with silent reverence, their clipboards forgotten as they watched a miracle unfold inch by inch. Even the mansion staff, usually detached from the family's struggles, found themselves sneaking glances into the room, unable to ignore the extraordinary sight of a boy helping the woman of the house reclaim her strength. On the third day, the progress was undeniable. Anna managed to lift her leg slightly on her own, her breath hitching with joy. Richard had been watching from the doorway, and when he saw the motion, his composure shattered. The powerful CEO, who had stared down rivals in boardrooms with unshakable.com, found himself blinking away tears. He rushed forward, kneeling by his wife, grasping her hand with trembling fingers. "Anna, you did it," he whispered. She smiled through her exhaustion, her eyes shining brighter than they had in years. Ethan, sitting cross-legged on the floor, allowed himself a small grin, but quickly redirected his focus. "Not done yet," he said softly. "There's more your body can remember." His words carried no arrogance, only quiet conviction. And Richard felt his heart twist with gratitude for the boy who had entered their lives so unexpectedly. By the fifth day, whispers of Anna's progress had reached beyond the mansions. Family members who had once grown distant after years of failed treatments began visiting again, their faces marked by disbelief. Some doctors, hearing of the strange recovery, requested to observe. Though skeptical, they could not ignore the testimonies spreading from within the Carter household. On that evening, Ethan guided Anna as she practiced pushing herself forward in the chair. Her arms trembled, her knuckles white from gripping the wooden handles. But each effort brought her a little closer to independence. "That's it," Ethan encouraged, his voice steady. "Every push tells your body it can trust itself again." The doctors murmured among themselves, their clinical detachment shaken by what they saw. The seventh day arrived, and with it, a sense of expectation that hung heavy in the air. The Carter mansion's great hall was prepared, its polished marble floor gleaming under the soft glow of chandeliers. Chairs had been arranged for the small gathering of family, doctors, and staff who had come to witness what they once would have dismissed as impossible. Richard stood near his wife's chair, his heart pounding harder than it had during any business deal or public speech. Anna sat quietly, her hands resting on the armrests, her breathing steady. Ethan crouched beside her, whispering gently, "It's time. Trust yourself. Trust what you've worked for. You are ready." Silence blanketed the room, as all eyes fixed on the woman who had not stood on her own in years. Anna closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling as she drew strength from somewhere deep within. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed her palms against the armrests. The effort showed immediately her arms quivered, her face flushed with strain. Ethan placed his hand lightly on her knee, not to lift her, but to remind her of his presence. Richard clenched his fists at his sides, whispering a prayer he hadn't dared speak in years. And then, like dawn breaking after a long night, Anna began to rise. Inch by inch, her body defied the chains of paralysis. Gasps rippled through the hall. One doctor dropped his pen in shock, while another covered her mouth with trembling hands. When Anna finally stood upright, balanced on her own two legs, the hall erupted in a stunned silence so profound it felt holy. Tears streamed freely down Richard's face as he rushed to her side, afraid she might fall, yet unwilling to steal the moment from her. Anna swayed, her legs trembling under the unfamiliar weight, but she steadied herself, her eyes locked on Richard's, overflowing with love and triumph. And then, taking one shaky step, and then another, she moved into his arms. Richard caught her, holding her as though he would never let go, his body racked with sobs of joy. The hall filled with applause, cheers, and the muffled cries of those who could not believe what they had witnessed. Even the doctors, when certain of her hopeless case, stood in awe, their scientific training crumbling against the reality before them. Ethan stood a few feet away, his small frame almost invisible against the grandeur of the room. Yet every eye eventually turned to him. He did not bask in the applause, nor did he smile with pride. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression calm and humble, as though this miracle had been inevitable all along. Richard, still holding Anna, turned toward the boy with tears streaming down his cheeks. Slowly, he released his wife and crossed the polished floor. In front of everyone, the doctors, the family, the staff. Richard Carter, the feared and respected CEO, sank to his knees before a 10-year-old boy. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke. "Ethan, you're not homeless anymore. From this day forward, you are family. My family." The room went still, every heart moved by the gravity of the moment. Ethan's lips parted in surprise, his wide eyes glistening. For so long, he had known nothing but hunger, loneliness, and the cruel indifference of the streets. And now, standing in the golden light of the Carter mansion, he was being offered not just shelter, but belonging. Richard placed a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder. "You gave me back my wife. You gave me back hope, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never suffer again." Anna, still leaning on her chair for support, extended her arms toward Ethan. "Come here, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling with maternal warmth. Ethan hesitated, then stepped forward, allowing himself to be pulled into her embrace. For the first time in years, the Carter family felt whole. That night, as the household celebrated with tears, laughter, and embraces, Ethan sat quietly beside Anna, watching her smile as she leaned against her husband. The mansion, once cold and distant, now felt alive with warmth. For the doctors who had witnessed the miracle, the event would forever remain a mystery they could not explain. For the Carter family, it was a gift beyond measure. And for Ethan, the boy who had wandered the streets alone, it was the moment his life transformed forever. No longer a nameless child lost in the world, he was now a son, a healer, and a symbol of hope. The boy who had once begged for scraps had given a family back their future, and in doing so, had found his own.